The Emperor of Mankind is the single most important figure in Warhammer 40K, bar none. The many decades of lore we've been given about him is hands down the most important lore in the entire setting. But was he a failure who ultimately led humanity into damnation, the most selfless hero who ever lived, or something in between? The short answer is yes, and it's complicated. But if you want a more thorough look at just who the Emperor is and why he did what he did, then you're in the right place. So in this video, I'm going to go deep into just who the Emperor is. We'll begin with his birth and early life and continue through the Unification Wars and the Great Crusade. And before we get too far in, I just have to say that I have had to really re-examine how I feel about Big E since making this video. Some of the things that he did that I just disagreed with for decades, I am now finding that I see the justification for, and vice versa. But this just may be due to the fact that recently much of the lore surrounding the Emperor's early life, and ultimately his death, has been retconned. So without further ado, the being that would eventually become known as the God Emperor of Mankind was born in Anatolia, what is now modern-day Turkey, during the transitional period of human civilization that saw the birth of the Bronze Age. He was born to normal, regular parents despite the intense nature of his conception. During this time in early civilization, when the human race was just beginning to wake up to its psychic potential, and the earliest human psykers were just emerging on the scene, the Emperor came to be. The shaman were basically the first sort of proto-psykers of the human race, and they were being consumed upon death, their souls devoured in the warp by dark entities that were just beginning to stir. The gestating chaos gods. The dark gods grew in power as the shaman would incarnate, live, die, and have their souls consumed. These proto-psykers were used to reincarnating after death, their souls coming back again and again, carrying forward the occult knowledge they'd acquired through their many lifetimes. So eventually the shaman were able to piece together what was happening. They foresaw that without the psychic might that humanity was starting to develop, the entirety of the human race would end up extinct as chaos swelled in power. The entirety of humanity feeding their ever-growing hunger. And the shaman came up with a plan, so that upon death, they wouldn't have to worry about being consumed, nor would they have to worry about reincarnating. However, it would come at a terrible cost, a massive sacrifice. And remember that word, sacrifice, as it is one of the common themes that plays out again and again over the millennia of the Emperor's existence. The shaman held a conclave, and during this great meeting, came up with a plan to commit mass unaliving, and sent all their souls to the warp at once. This overwhelmed the proto-dark gods, and the soul energies merged into one cohesive super soul, essentially. And this burned the warp entities, a massive flame that lit them up and drove them back, as the souls became one united essence and one unified force that hit the warp like a nuclear bomb. And thus the Emperor was conceived, in the warp, born upon the sacrifice of thousands of early psykers, the combined essence of thousands of lifetimes, each having themselves reincarnated many times. The ultimate human came to be. And this part about the shaman and how they all ascended into one being is one of the major things that was changed. Now he is simply considered to be the first true psyker and perpetual, an extraordinary mutant who is the reincarnation of the extinct shaman. Still somehow collectively, thousands of shaman, but Games Workshop now really seem to be trying to distance themselves from the original Heaven's Gate sort of storyline, and I honestly don't really blame them. The current lore just states that nothing is really known about the Emperor, and Imperial records mention him first during the Age of Strife. So now he is basically just a mutant warlord super psyker who is the collective souls of shaman who had each themselves reincarnated countless times, and he is in touch with those lives more and more as time progresses, giving him access to a vast wealth of knowledge, both historical and metaphysical. Horus later on does state that he knows that his father, the Emperor, was born and lived his own childhood in Anatolia. His physical birth occurred exactly 1 year after the shaman's conclave, and he was born to a normal family of farmers and herders, sometime around 10 to 11,000 years before our current time here in the 21st century, near the river Sakarya. His psychic powers were so strong that in the womb his DNA was basically altered, and the effect was that it rendered him a perpetual. So strong was his might in the metaphysical realm that it made his body effectively immortal. This was quite a boon, as it meant that the warp would not claim him and consume him upon death. The Emperor would simply rejuvenate, returning to life and thus denying the dark powers their ultimate meal. In his early life, the Emperor lived pretty much like anyone else in his village, but one day his father died. And this didn't set well with the Emperor, who may have opened up his might for the first real time and gotten in touch with his psychic powers due to his heightened emotional state. The Emperor received a clairvoyant vision and knew the truth, that his uncle had slain his father. Empowered with that knowledge, the child who would become the master of mankind used telekinesis to stop his uncle's heart, slaying him outright. But the Emperor did not take any pleasure at the act, nor did he show sorrow. It was pretty much just absolutely pragmatic, and even though it was his grief that led him to get in touch with his true power, he did not kill his uncle out of any sort of emotional reaction. It was purely calculated and cold-blooded, which seems quite appropriate. After slaying his uncle, the new man, as he came to be known, realized that humanity needed direction, some sort of law and order to guide and govern them, and so went to Mesopotamia, to one of the earliest human cities, perhaps as it was said to literally be the first human city. Now, it has been said that the Emperor never lived openly during this era as the new man, and lived many lives under many identities, always trying to steer humanity in the right direction by promoting peace and harmony. It is never explicitly stated that he was Hammurabi, but it is hinted at, and would be appropriate, as Hammurabi is recorded as the first king to come up with a code of ethics for his subjects to live and abide by, basically inventing the law. But there are many places in the lore that let us know some of the many identities throughout history that were just cover identities for the Emperor. For one, he is known to have been Alexander the Great, and it has been widely speculated and hinted at by Games Workshop, and if I recall correctly, was overtly stated to be Jesus of Nazareth and Muhammad as well. But no matter what form and identity the Emperor of Mankind took, he was never able to unify humanity under one purpose, under one vision. And it was during this time that those dark energies in the warp became full-blown chaos gods, having siphoned off enough of humanity's psychic energies to fully manifest in the warp as unique individual beings. The first god, Khorne, came to be, and the world was plunged into darkness and warfare. Soon, Tzeentch followed, and intrigue and politics became convoluted and complicated. Finally, Nurgle arose during the Great Plagues of the Middle Ages. And then the Emperor truly had enemies, and was aware of these new, malignant presences that were spawned by the darkest extremes of human nature. He attempted to persuade people to live in peace, as that would stop feeding the dark powers. During the 20th millennium, approximately during the Age of Technology, when humans built their first star-spanning civilization, the Emperor left Terra for a while, traveling on a ship that was very slow indeed, as it was before humans were capable of warp travel to go faster than light. He set out from Terra with a group of perpetuals, including his best friend Malcador and Olivia Surica, who shows up throughout many of the novels. The Emperor wants to unite humanity and bring every planet that was colonized by humans under one banner, though this was still thousands of years before he unified Terra. But the lack of faster-than-light travel is impeding any progress. So Big E travels to the planet Molech, and there finds a warp gate. Now, there's a lot of speculation and assumption going on in the community when it comes to just what happened in the warp. Some of the dominant theories are that the Emperor made a deal with the Chaos Gods, and that the Emperor stole power from the gods. We don't know for sure exactly what happened on Molech. That is yet to be completely revealed to us. But we do know that many of the other perpetuals with the Emperor pretty much stopped hanging out with him and found what he did to be distasteful. Some claimed that he stole fire from the gods, referencing the Greek myth of Prometheus taking knowledge from the gods and being punished for giving it to humans. But whatever the Emperor got, it was a huge power-up. He became extremely powerful, as if he had drank deep of the stuff of the warp itself and become swollen with its power. Astropaths began to spring up on human worlds, and interstellar travel sped up to incredible speeds as warp travel became possible. But not all the other perpetuals were good with that even, as some stated that using the power of the warp to fight the dark gods of the warp was moving backwards, traveling in the wrong direction and creating possible future problems. But it was after Molech that Malkador said the Emperor had truly changed into something truly godlike. And while there is so much fan speculation as to what happened, and we know that many of the Perpetuals abandoned the Emperor after Molech, we do get a couple of characters who were there remembering and referencing what happened in the End and the Death books. First, we have Malkador, sitting upon the Golden Throne at the Siege of Terra, so more than 10,000 years after Molech, as the Emperor boards the vengeful spirit in the final confrontation of his life. You have brought the Emperor face to face with chaos first found, closer than when he sat upon the throne or walked the shrieking halls of the Webway, perhaps closer even than when he last faced the Four and took their fire from them on Molech. You have brought chaos to his very door and forced him to look it in the eye. Do not then expect him not to use it. I see him look down at his hands. They are sheathed in auramite because it is almost quantum inert and thus most efficacious in the manipulation of immaterial forces. Bare skin is better. This much he knows. He tears his right gauntlet off, hangs it from his harness, and seizes the immaterium with bare hand and a bared mind. It is scalding and alive with anger, but my lord is no longer constrained by the constant duties of the throne. That is my burden now. There is no time. There are no clocks. There is no pain. My master hears only the crackle of the warp. I watch as he harnesses that sound and uses it as a focus, a drishti, to regulate his work. The immaterial presses at him. It seeks to overwhelm and drain him, but he underestimates its fire. It is the same fire he stole from the Four Annihilators and used to keep them at bay, the same fire he has wielded for centuries to drive them back whenever they have come too close. They flinched then from their own fire. They flinch now. You have forced this confrontation first found. You have brought my lord into a realm of chaos to face you. Did you think that would weaken him and grind him down? How can he grow weak when there is limitless power around him to draw upon? You do not put out a fire by throwing fuel upon it. He draws upon your flames. Over the millennia he has worn many masks, each suitable to the task at hand. His mind, his greatest gift, allows him flexibility in such things. Now you see him at his truest aspect, as terrible as he can be when terror is the only recourse. He is Ordo ab Chaos. He is Lux in Tenebris. And later we see a custodian speaking about the Emperor and what he had become, or had to do on Molech, also from the End and the Death. The Master of Mankind continues to draw upon the very power unleashed against him. He steals it, just as he stole fire on Molech, and hurls it back. He casts flame storms from his fingertips with such force that the shrilling Neverborn, live birthed out of the vortex, incinerate before they have full substance, and the ship's corridors, briefly recalling the metal from which they were once made, burst and shred from the overpressure. His sword, a blade of blazing sunlight, cleaves materia and immateria alike, and fills the air with scalding blood steam. His fury is boundless. So is this hell. The bestial Neverborn, instantiate everywhere, massed in wailing legions of the damned, the manifest armies of pandemonium, in unvanquishable numbers. They seek to kill him, not just in body, but his entirety. Horns and fangs and slicing talons swarm to shred him, to tear armor from flesh, and flesh from bone, and soul from body. They seek to destroy not just his mortal shell, but the perpetual spark within him. He will not be beaten, he will not be turned back, though chaos assaults the Emperor with unprecedented ire, unleashing its power in a condensed paroxysm that exceeds all the warp events in human history. He will not back down. He meets the excess of chaos with its own excess, pushing his power beyond any cautious restrictions he has previously respected. He has always been a conduit too, resilient enough to tolerate the burning wire of immaterial force that sizzles in his blood. He has been training himself to stand it for more than 30,000 years. He has conditioned himself to bear its force, to tap it, to use it, to inhale its fire and breathe it back in the faces of the Chaos Pantheon. They have opened the sunless sea of the Empyrean to him, and so he drinks from it to magnify his own almighty power. The false four are fools if they think this display of excess can overwhelm him. It empowers him, Horus Lupercal. It empowers him. It feeds him in excess of his own. He is set on this path first found, and he will find his way to you. He will carve a sure and inexorable road through your labyrinth of madness, his sword in his right hand and fire in his left, and meet you. He will find you. Now, both Malcador and the Custodian have interesting perspectives on what happened, and they don't definitely say anything we couldn't infer already. However, one thing we do know is that for whatever reason, whether he stole power, was simply able to get in touch with power, or whether he made a deal with the Chaos Gods themselves, we do know that he came away from Molech a much more powerful psyker, and capable of many of the things we know him for later in the timeline. But the main thing he had was new knowledge, the knowledge of how to create the Primarchs and the Space Marine legions of the Adeptus Astartes, and to spread the light of Terra across the galaxy. But before the Emperor could use his newly gained powers, humanity would plunge into an age of darkness and despair unlike anything it had ever known. The age of technology gave way to the Age of Strife, an apocalyptic nightmare that humanity was barely able to survive. Tens of billions died from disease, famine, and constant warfare as the golden age of humanity that began in the Age of Technology fell apart, and the Emperor realized that if humanity was to survive, he would have to unite all of us under his glorious rule. But first, he had to conquer Terra. And this is where we get to the Unification Wars and the dawning of the Imperium of Man, where the being whose friends and companions knew him as Neoth would become the Emperor of Mankind. So, far in our future, in the 29th millennium, the Emperor set out to truly unite humanity under one banner, his. Terra was ruled by various warlords known as techno-barbarians, of which the Emperor was considered to be among the strongest at the time, though current imperial records do not refer to him with such crude and basic titles. It was this campaign against the other techno-barbarians that became known as the Unification Wars. And this series of massive conflicts raged across the globe, leaving untold dead in its wake. This was the first time the Emperor would employ the use of genetically enhanced super soldiers. He created his Thunder Warriors to bring the techno-barbarians and their armies to their knees. Using chemical and genetic enhancement along with bionic implantation, this was kind of a rushed process that he was using on adults, many of which did not take the process well. Eventually, many of the Thunder Warriors perished due to their metabolism just completely collapsing. Others slowly deteriorated as they aged, becoming insane or completely psychotic. But the Thunder Warriors fighting for the Emperor were able to unify Terra, the final battle occurring at Mount Ararat. But by this time, the Thunder Warriors were aware that they had been cursed with short lifespans and horrific lives, and cursed the Emperor, and many turned on him. The Emperor unleashed his custodians, finely crafted super soldiers individually made by the Emperor himself, who served as his elite shock troops and bodyguard. Each one represented the resources of several entire worlds just to create them. And along with the Custodes, for the first time, the Space Marines of the Adeptus Astartes hit the battlefield in the form of a prototype version of the First Legion. So, in their most rudimentary form, the Dark Angels were there alongside the Custodes as the Thunder Warriors were culled. The original super soldiers destroyed in order to make way for the true force the Emperor had been working on, the Space Marines. Soldiers created from the gene seed of the Primarchs, who at this point were still all lost as the Emperor had not yet recovered Horus, who would come to be known as the First Found. Unless, of course, Alfarius is to be believed, as he claims to have been found upon Terra itself and raised in secret by the Emperor and Malcador. But the Imperial propaganda that was spread was that the Thunder Warriors all died at Mount Ararat, but were able to win the day. The story went as far as to say that a lone Thunder Warrior was able to hoist the Emperor's fallen banner back up just before he died as his final act. This warrior was named Eric Tyrannus, and the irony is that he didn't even die in the battle and was even able to avoid the Custodes and Dark Angels culling the original super soldiers. But the story of the few surviving Thunder Warriors and what they went on to do is the subject of another video. So, once the ultimate generals, in the form of the Primarchs, were created, the Emperor was ready to set off on the greatest undertaking in the history of humanity, the Great Crusade. Only one problem. The powers of chaos scattered the infant Primarchs in their gestation pods to the warp. So during the conquest of the galaxy, the Emperor would slowly recover his lost Primarchs, one by one. And it was a slow grind. But before he left the solar system, the Emperor would unify Mars and Terra, which had both controlled their own interstellar empires and been in cooperation since the Age of Technology, but had many falling outs. And this is probably the first thing the Emperor does that is beyond the pale. I mean, it is absolutely hypocritical. But in order to secure Martian support for him and the Imperium, and secure their technological superiority and expertise, as well as their foundries and forge worlds, which he would need for the Great Crusade, the Emperor made the deal known to Terrans as the Treaty of Mars and to the Martians as the Treaty of Olympus Mons. And in making that deal, the Emperor presented himself as a god, as what the Martian priests referred to as the Omnissiah, the machine god. And the Emperor knew this was not cool and flew in the face of everything he was about to spread as the imperial truth throughout the galaxy, but he did it, and he secured the Martian support. After some internal fighting and bloodshed, it was settled. The machine cult would be allowed to remain operating, as it respected the Emperor of mankind as their one true god. The Emperor laid the foundation for the damnation of mankind when he did this. Or, from another point of view, perhaps the Martians were truly the first people in the galaxy to recognize the divinity of Neoth, to see not just the Emperor of mankind, but the God Emperor of mankind. Praise the Omnissiah! With Martian support secured, the Emperor set out on the Great Crusade to bring the light of Terra to the galaxy. As he was aware of chaos, he thought that if he could spread an imperial cult of absolute atheism and disbelief, and what he called false gods, then he could deprive the chaos gods of any worship from humanity and starve them out. Horus was the first Primarch that imperial records state was found. He was basically with the Emperor as the only Primarch for over an entire regular human lifetime before another Primarch was found. He got to know the Emperor one-on-one in a way the other generals of the legions never would, and often gets referred to as the Emperor's favorite son. Horus Lupercal of the planet of Chthoniya, which was so close to Terra it could actually be reached with sublight engines. As Horus and the Emperor fought their way across the galaxy, they destroyed entire alien civilizations that stood in the way of the Imperium's expansion and hegemonic dominance of the galaxy. They scourged human empires that would not become compliant. They fought side by side against endless waves of orcs and on more than one occasion saved each other's lives. They discovered new worlds for humans to populate and uncovered old forgotten worlds with human colonies that had been lost since the Age of Technology. And it was amazing what they were able to accomplish, spreading the imperial truth far and wide. Until the second Primarch discovery happened, and the Emperor met his son, Leman Russ. Now, Russ was nothing like Horus, which took Horus aback. Russ had a code of chivalry and honor and perhaps the fiercest loyalty of any Primarch. Well, it can be argued at least. But Russ was a barbarian who kept the company of beasts and animals. Russ, to Horus, was an embarrassment, something to look down upon, and their meeting may have just planted the first seed of contempt in the Chthonian Primarch's heart. But as they went, the Great Crusade would gather more Primarchs, some from industrial worlds, some from feral death worlds. Some had become leaders, others slaves. No two Primarchs had the same experience, but each one brought something to the table the others did not. And at the front of their Space Marine legions, the Primarchs conquered the galaxy. The Emperor had his ultimate important mission he was working on in the background and decided to duck out of the Great Crusade, and he left Horus in charge, and bestowed upon the Primarch the title of War Master of the Imperium. Though he was supposed to be the first among equals, he soon became, in both his mind and the minds of many of his brothers, the favored and most exalted son of the Emperor. As for now, the Emperor is back on Terra, and he's fired up a device that was found during the Age of Technology, the Golden Throne. As long as he sits on this gigantic golden device and powers it with his psychic might, he has access to the Eldar's Webway, an ancient pocket dimension that allows interstellar travel without having to go through the warp. And the plan is to get the Webway portal on Terra permanently connected to the Webway, so that humans can access other human worlds easily and safely without fear of chaos attacks, something the Emperor is still lying to his sons and the Imperium about, still spreading the imperial truth, and denying that any gods exist, himself or otherwise. And speaking of imperial truth, the Emperor found out that the Primarch Lorgar was setting up cults that worshiped the Emperor as a god on every world he conquered. And for this, Lorgar and his Word-Bearers Legion were censured by the Emperor. On the world of Kur, the Word-Bearers had built an opulent city in honor of their god emperor, named Monarchia, and it was a real jewel. But the Emperor sent Rabute Gilliman and the Ultramarines Legion to destroy Monarchia, and they absolutely razed the city. Then the Word-Bearers were forced to kneel in the ashes, pushed to their knees against their will by the psychic might of the Emperor. And this set in Lorgar a disdain for his father, who he had elevated to a god in his mind. And so Lorgar felt that even if the Emperor was a god, he was not deserving of worship, and so turned to chaos, the first Primarch to do so, and it would be agents of his legion, Erebus in particular, who would ultimately sow the seeds of corruption throughout the legions and spark the greatest civil war among humanity that the galaxy had ever seen. So while the Emperor is distracted with his Webway project, and the Great Crusade is winding down, Horus Lupercal is laid low by chaos on the world of Davin, barely clinging to life in a coma-like fugue. Horus is deceived into accepting the powers of chaos. He's slowly and methodically manipulated by the dark gods and their servants until little remains of his true self, and he just follows his own paranoia and delusions into damnation, not just for himself, but the whole of humanity. And so the greatest thing ever given to us by Games Workshop, the Horus Heresy, begins. The ultimate war that saw the loss of untold billions, led by the superhuman demigod sons of the Emperor himself. The entire galaxy would burn. But that is the subject of part 2, the next video,